the previous episode of our series, I invited you to do something almost no one dares to do: to take Jesus down from the altar and lay him on the cold table of historical analysis. We raised a dangerous question: what if the Jesus we were taught to worship is not a historical man, but a theological construction carefully assembled over the centuries? We looked at the silences of ancient sources and the contradictions between the Gospels, and we stopped right there at the edge of the abyss. If this is true, an even darker question appears. If the story was constructed, who was the architect? Who decided which books would survive and which would be destroyed? Who turned a spiritual school, born on the margins of the empire, into the official religion of the empire itself? Who needed to raise up an external Christ to control millions of people through guilt, fear, and blind obedience? Theology usually answers with silence. Sermons look the other way. But the traces are still there, scattered in decrees, political murders, and alliances sealed in blood. If in the previous episode we questioned the image of the hero, now we are going to start hunting the engineer of the narrative. Because behind the Christ you think you know, there is a shadowy mind that is almost never mentioned. And it is with that mind that this new investigation begins. From an early age, we were trained to fear an enigmatic figure, the Antichrist. In sermons, he appears as a tyrant of the future, a political religious monster who will one day deceive all humanity. But what if the greatest deception is not in the future, but in the past? What if the real Antichrist is not a demon pulled out of an apocalyptic movie, but a man of flesh and blood, dressed in imperial robes, surrounded by generals, bishops, and advisors? A man who did not destroy Christianity, but rewrote it. Someone who never banned the name of Jesus, but chose which version of Jesus would be allowed. Who didn't need to burn every book, only to select which ones would be called inspired and which ones would be condemned as heresy. This Antichrist doesn't walk into the church knocking crosses down. He comes in through the front door, smiles at religious leaders, signs decrees, calls councils, and slowly turns a spiritual school into a state religion. A system in which faith serves politics and the sacred serves the throne. It is about this architect of official faith that we are going to talk. A man capable of using the cross as a weapon, doctrine as law, and guilt as an invisible chain. As we follow the trail of the decisions he made, the enemies he ordered silenced, and the blood that was spilled even inside his own family, one inevitable question begins to echo. If this man is not the Antichrist, then what else would he have to do to deserve that title? Before it became a machine of dogmas, Christianity was, for a brief moment, almost something else. If you go back in time, before official creeds, before cathedrals and converted emperors, you find small groups on the margins of the system, the Essenes. They lived far from the big cities, in simple communities, often in the desert. They weren't perfect nor angelic mystics, but they had a vision very different from what we call religion today. For them, the body was not the enemy of the soul. The body was the temple. Washings, fasts, oils, bread and wine were not just external rituals. They were symbolic languages for an inner process of purification and awakening. Salvation did not come from repeating ready-made phrases, but from transforming one's own life, cell by cell, habit by habit. When they spoke of Christ, they were not referring to a divine surname of some Roman Palestinian individual, but to a state of consciousness, something that is born within, grows in silence, and, one day, takes over the entire life. In this reading, anointed is not a magic title, it is a process. The ordinary human being slowly becoming a whole human being. This Christianity of the Essenes did not need palaces, thrones, or armies. It needed time, discipline, silence, and courage to face the truth about oneself. It was dangerous not because it threatened the empire with weapons, but because it taught people not to depend blindly on intermediaries between them and the sacred. Now imagine the clash between this vision and a world ruled by paranoid generals, senators, and emperors. A world in which everything is about buying loyalty, controlling narratives, and fearing rebellions. While a few spoke about an inner kingdom, Rome was collapsing from within. And this is where the question is born that will guide us into the next chapter. How could an empire in crisis look at this silent movement and see in it not a threat, but a golden opportunity? When we look at Rome in this period, we no longer see the shine of its peak. We see a tired giant, endless civil wars, generals proclaiming themselves emperors, entire provinces threatening to break away. Money was losing its value, taxes were rising, soldiers were deserting. On the frontiers, the so-called barbarians were testing the empire's walls more and more. On the outside, there were still roads, amphitheaters, statues. On the inside, everything was creaking. The old gods no longer had the same effect. Jupiter, Mars, Venus. The temples were still standing, but the trust in them was dissolving. Rome had many gods, many cults, many rituals, but it no longer had a story capable of uniting heart and fear under the same banner. What does an empire do when it realizes that swords are no longer enough? It goes looking for an idea. Among slaves, the poor, low-ranking soldiers and women, a new message was circulating in quiet houses and nighttime gatherings. One single God, a wronged son, a promise of life after death. A faith that offered meaning to suffering, value to the humiliated, dignity to those who would never have a seat in the Senate. From a spiritual point of view, it was a call to inner transformation. From a political point of view, it was an invisible army in formation. Disciplined people, capable of obeying an invisible authority, who met regularly, shared resources, helped one another, and were willing to die for the belief that this world is not the end. For an empire in crisis, that could seem frightening or extremely useful. It only needed one thing, someone at the top who would decide that, instead of crushing this movement, it would be better to dress it in the colors of the empire, to turn martyrs into soldiers, to turn the symbol of the condemned, the cross, into a banner of victory. And this is exactly where the story changes tone, because in the next chapter, we'll follow the moment when a man of power looks at a simple sign and sees in it not just faith, but the missing piece to save his throne. When the empire seemed to be falling apart, a man appeared, willing to bet everything on a new symbol. His name, Constantine. In 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he was not a saint in spiritual crisis. He was a general fighting for the highest power in Rome. The throne was at stake. If he lost, he would die. If he won, he would rule the known world. It is in this context that the famous story of the vision of the cross appears. Some versions say he saw a luminous sign in the sky in the shape of a cross, accompanied by the words, "In this sign you shall conquer." Others speak of a dream the night before in which Christ supposedly appeared, giving him instructions for war. The fact is, the next day, soldiers of a pagan empire march with a new symbol painted on their shields, the Christian labarum. The cross, an instrument of torture used by Rome to crush rebels, is turned into a talisman of imperial victory. Constantine wins, and soon after, he goes from potential persecutor to protector of the new faith. In 313, with the so-called Edict of Milan, he grants freedom of worship to Christians, returns their properties, and begins to flood the once persecuted religion with favors and privileges. Sudden conversion, mystical revelation, or careful calculation. By adopting the God of the persecuted, Constantine not only pacifies part of the population, he gains a network of organized communities, disciplined, used to obeying leadership, and willing to die for what they believe. If this God grants victory in war and still unifies the empire from within, why not call him the one and only true God? From then on, something silent and deep begins to happen. The faith of the marginalized walks through the palace gates. The bishops draw closer to the throne, and the man who had marched with the cross on his sword realizes he can do something even greater than win a battle. He can decide, in front of everyone, who is and who is not the Christ. In the next step of this story, we won't just see a symbol in the sky. We will see that symbol being officially turned into a person. 13 years after the famous vision of the cross, another stage is set, this time without swords, but with something just as lethal: words. In 325 CE, the emperor summons bishops from various parts of the empire for an unprecedented meeting in the city of Nicaea. Officially, the goal is to resolve doctrinal disputes, especially a theological quarrel about who exactly Jesus is in relation to God. But beneath the surface, the real question is another. Which version of Christ will best serve the empire? Up to that point, Christianity was not a single thing. There were more mystical currents, groups who read the texts as allegories of body and soul, communities who spoke of Christ as an inner principle, a flame, an anointing, a state of consciousness. There were also those who insisted on a more literal, historical, concrete reading, a single man in a single time with a single biography. Nicaea functions like a final court. On one side, a spirituality that speaks in symbols: light, oil, bread, wine, the body as temple. On the other, the political need for a single, clear, unquestionable figure who could be painted on banners, proclaimed in official speeches, sworn upon by soldiers and subjects. When the bishops, under the emperor's gaze, start debating Christ's nature, substance, and essence, it sounds like abstract philosophy. But what's at stake is brutally simple. Will Christ be understood as a living code, repeated in every human being, or as a single distant character, placed on an unreachable pedestal? In Nicaea, what was once symbol begins to be frozen into a person. What was once an inner map becomes a sacred biography. Instead of Christ in you, it becomes Christ for you. For the empire, that is perfect. If salvation depends on believing correctly in an official story, whoever controls the story controls the souls. On the outside, the people see only a creed being born. On the inside, something far deeper is being redesigned, the very structure of spiritual experience. And this is where our investigation takes an even bolder step. In the next chapter, we will look at this operation not only as a theological council, but as the exact moment when the Antichrist, in the most hidden sense of the word, begins to take form. When we look at Nicaea as a simple debate between bishops, we miss the real earthquake happening beneath the words. It wasn't just about theology, it was about deciding what kind of Christ the world would know for the next centuries. In the early days of the Christian movement, many people understood Jesus and Christ in a way very different from what you hear in pulpits today. Christ was not seen merely as the surname of an individual, but as a living principle, an inner force. The idea that the body is a temple was not a poetic metaphor, it was taken literally. The oil, the anointing, the inner light, all of that pointed to a process happening inside the very flesh, in the nervous system, in the blood, in the breath, in the way a person lived and transformed. When someone said that Christ comes in the flesh, they meant this: the divine descends, dwells, grows, and manifests within you. Not on a distant altar, not in some remote time, but now, as you breathe. Little by little, however, another reading gained strength. A reading that traded the inner map for an external story. In Nicaea, under the emperor's attentive gaze, that shift was crystallized. The symbols of the body began to be treated as if they were only episodes of a biography. What could once be read as a code for transformation was now declared to be historical fact that had to be accepted without question. Christ ceased to be, primarily, a state of consciousness and became almost exclusively a specific man in a specific address of history, whose magical death would once and for all solve the spiritual condition of anyone who believed the right way. Salvation was moved from the inside to the outside. Instead of a path of inner work, discipline, and awakening, it was enough to adhere to the approved narrative. At this point, the Antichrist is born, not as a movie monster, but as a doctrinal structure. Antichrist, here, is not just someone who hates Jesus, but an entire system that in practice denies the presence of the inner Christ. It pulls the focus away from what happens in your flesh, in your body, in your consciousness, and throws it outside, far away, onto a past event and an external authority that holds the keys to the correct story. Feel the power this gives a ruler. If salvation depends on believing in the right doctrinal package, whoever controls the package also controls guilt, fear, the sense of forgiveness, and of condemnation. An emperor can be drenched in blood up to his neck and still feel clean if the system tells him that it is enough to recite the right formula, support the right faith, fund the right church. But a man willing to reorganize the faith of millions must also be willing to sacrifice whatever is necessary to keep that construction standing, including, if needed, his own family. And that is exactly what we are going to see in the next chapter. How the architect of this new doctrine plunged into a trail of blood that ran through his son, his wife, and, according to ancient traditions, even his own mother. After erecting an official Christ for the empire, the emperor believed he had faith under control. But there was still one thing he did not control: his own blood. And in Rome, too much blood means too much memory, too many secrets, too much risk. The first to fall was the son. Crispus was young, charismatic, victorious in his military campaigns. The soldiers trusted him, the people admired him. In an empire built on distrust, a strong heir is always seen as a threat. A few whispers are enough, some cloudy accusations, stories of conspiracy, and the son turns into an enemy. With no transparent trial, no real defense, only a quiet sentence: he must die. The man who presented himself as the protector of Christ becomes the executioner of his own firstborn. But the deepest secret was not in the son. It was in the women of the house. The emperor's mother was not just a devout old lady. She knew older traditions, linked to those groups living on the margins of the system, the heirs of the Essenian vision. For her, Christ was not only an official title stamped on coins and decrees, but an inner path, a transformation taking place in the body and in consciousness. She looked with suspicion at the fusion of throne and altar, cross and sword. The wife, in turn, saw everything from inside the palace. She heard the conversations, the advice, the discussions between bishops and generals. She knew there was a Christianity before the decrees, a Christianity that needed neither crowns nor armies. And, according to old traditions, both the mother and the wife resisted, to different degrees, the idea of burying forever those Essenes secrets, the idea of a living Christ in each person, not imprisoned in an imperial dogma. For a ruler who had bet everything on the new doctrine, that was intolerable. If those voices gained strength, if someone connected the dots and publicly claimed that the official Christ was only a watered-down shadow of a deeper knowledge, the entire theological and political building could collapse. So the empire did what it always does when it feels threatened. It's silenced. The son is executed. The wife is secretly condemned in a bath that becomes a weapon of death. She is thrown alive into boiling oil. In some traditions, even the mother is cast into final silence for knowing too much and trusting too little in the new state religion. In the end, what we see is a pattern. Those who carried within the imperial household echoes of the Essenian secrets are eliminated one by one, not only because of family intrigue, but so that the inner Christ would be buried along with them. But silencing people is one thing, silencing the sky is another. In the next chapter, we will see how the same power that spilled blood inside his own family also tried to rewrite the very times and seasons, altering calendars, feasts, and cosmic symbols so that no one could read in the movement of the stars, the key that connected the human being to the true Christ. After he silenced the voices inside his own house, the emperor turned to something even greater than family, church, or army, the sky. Because since ancient times, it was not the palace that marked the rhythm of life, it was the heavens. The sun rose and set in a sacred cycle. The moon waxed, waned, disappeared, and was reborn. Equinoxes and solstices were thresholds, moments when the sky seemed to speak louder, when entire peoples adjusted their planting, harvests, feasts, and rituals. The Essenes and other initiatory groups saw in these cycles a mirror of what happens inside the human being: death and rebirth, light descending into darkness and returning transformed. Times and seasons were not just dates carved in stone, they were keys. For an emperor who wanted a docile Christianity, that was far too dangerous. As long as people continued reading the sky directly, there would still be room for spiritual experiences outside the control of the official religion. So if it was not possible to erase the stars, it was possible to tamper with the calendar. Little by little, decrees and decisions began to appear, reorganizing time. One day of the week is set apart, lifted above the others, turned into an official marker of rest and worship. Festivals connected to the sun are dressed in Christian clothing, given new names, new meanings, new stories. The same sky, another narrative. Church councils define when certain celebrations should take place, no longer only by direct observation of the heavens or ancient tradition, but by calculations approved by the empire and the church. You don't change the orbits, you change the interpretations. With that, the people keep on looking at the sky. But instead of seeing an open book, they see a confirmation of the official agenda. The harvests go on, the cycles go on, life goes on. Only now, between humanity and the stars, there is a filter, the Imperial Christian calendar. To control time is to control the rhythm of the body, of work, of feast, of fasting, of guilt, and of forgiveness. It is to dictate when you must stop, when you must celebrate, when you must feel unworthy, when you must kneel. With doctrine adjusted and the heavens translated, there was only one step left to complete the work: to fuse altar and throne, once and for all, faith and sword. In the next chapter, we will see how this new religion, aligned with the empire, turns into a powerful machine. One creed, one church, one ruler, and millions of lives trapped inside this invisible web. When the dust of Nicaea begins to settle, something new rises at the center of the known world, a religion aligned with the throne. It is no longer just a movement of outcasts gathered in simple homes. Now, Christianity wears purple. Bishops who once feared persecution are welcomed into palaces. What used to be discreet assemblies become administrative structures. Cathedrals rise, not only as places of worship, but as monuments of authority. At the doors, the humble crowd. Inside, faith and politics embrace like old accomplices. The approved creed begins to function like a password. Believing the right way ceases to be a spiritual search and becomes a requirement of the civilized world. Those who repeat the formula are considered orthodox, trustworthy, worthy of offices and favors. Those who question, hesitate, or remember older and deeper readings are labeled heretics. And what does the empire do with heretics? The same thing it always did with any threat. It marginalizes, persecutes, silences, and often destroys. The cross, which once was the symbol of the condemned, now hangs over courts and battlefields. Soldiers march under the sign of the one who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," while laws are written in the name of a single God, alongside the name of a single emperor. Whoever disobeys the church, disobeys the state. Whoever disobeys the state, disobeys God. Faith, which once spoke of a kingdom not of this world, becomes the perfect ideological glue to support this world exactly as it is, with its hierarchies, its privileges, its holy wars, and its poor tamed by the promise of reward after death. The machine is complete. a creed to unify minds, a church to manage souls, an empire to control bodies. But every machine reveals its true nature by the fruits it produces. If the root is a Christ turned into a tool of power, what kind of world grows from this tree? In the next chapter, we will leave the golden halls of the empire and look at the planet that grew in the shadow of this alliance between creed and sword, a world of ruins, blood, and guilt. And only after facing these ruins with brutal honesty will we be able to talk about something even bolder: how to dismantle, inside ourselves, what the Antichrist built on the outside. When we look back at the centuries that followed the imperialized religion, we don't see just well-organized doctrines. We see a trail, and that trail speaks louder than any council. Under the banner of that official Christ, cities were burned, entire peoples were branded as enemies of God, libraries were destroyed in the name of purity of faith. The same symbol that once represented a man tortured by the empire began to adorn the banners of armies, the shields of crusaders, the seals of kings who swore to kill for the glory of the Most High. The cross, once an instrument of shame, became a password for legitimacy in wars, invasions, and colonizations. It is enough to say that the other is a heretic, a pagan, an infidel, and suddenly any violence seems acceptable. The inner Christ, the one who invited people to intimate transformation, gives way to a monument Christ, used as a stamp to justify hunger, slavery, rape, and plunder. Inside the cities, the same logic continues. Women accused of witchcraft, men branded as deviants, thinkers who dared to ask too many questions. All of them met the holy face of torture, of the stake, of prison in the name of a supposed orthodoxy. It wasn't enough to control what people did. It was necessary to control what they could think, feel, imagine about the divine. And meanwhile, the masses were taught to always look outward, to a distant Christ, a distant authority, a distant paradise. The earth, the body, the mind, everything here was treated as something lesser, dirty, unworthy. An entire world sacrificed in the hope of another life no one has ever seen. But everyone was conditioned to fear losing. This is the fruit of the poisoned tree, a planet where guilt is worth more than awareness, obedience is worth more than truth, and the appearance of holiness is worth more than integrity. In this scenario, the Antichrist doesn't need horns. He manifests when an entire structure convinces human beings that they are too small, too filthy, too incapable to relate directly to the sacred that dwells within them. The result is right before our eyes: centuries of fear, silence, submission, and violence disguised as devotion. A world in emotional and spiritual ruins, built in the shadow of a Christ used as a tool of domination, while the true Christ, the one born in secret inside each of us, keeps waiting to be remembered. When this new religion fused with the empire, it did not remain confined within Rome's borders. It began to travel, not only in scrolls and sermons, but in ships, in swords, in flags planted in lands that had never heard of that official Christ. First came the holy wars within the continent itself. Armies marching under the sign of the cross to retake cities, destroy enemies declared infidels, pagans, heretics. Each conquered territory was another space where imperial faith had to be planted as absolute truth. Religion and geography merged. Wherever the flag arrived, the creed had to arrive too. Then came the great voyages, the so-called Age of Discovery, or, for those who were already there, the Age of Invasions. Entire peoples in Africa, the Americas, and Asia woke up one day to see ships with crosses on their sails rising on the horizon. The colonizers brought metal, gunpowder, diseases, and missionaries. The missionaries came with the Bible in hand, but behind them were cannons, crowns, and treaties. The speech was about salvation, but the practice was substitution. Languages erased, cultures demonized, ancient gods turned into caricatures of evil. The message was clear. Your world is over. From now on, you will be saved our way. How many children were baptized without understanding a single word? How many villages were destroyed for resisting the conqueror's faith? How many times did the phrase, "Accept Jesus," come, followed by an unspoken, "or else," pointed by the edge of a sword or the weight of a tax? In these cases, religion was not a choice matured over time. It was a condition for surviving, negotiating, existing within the new order. Those who accepted it gained the chance to live as second-class Christians. Those who refused often lost their land, their freedom, or their lives. And so, layer upon layer, the world was covered by this imperialized faith. Churches were built where ancient temples had once stood. Saints' days replaced ancestral rituals. Sin where once there had only been custom. Shame where once there had been identity. The sea of mud and blood we saw being born back there in the decisions of an emperor overflowed onto entire continents. Today, many of us are born already inside this murky water, calling normal what was imposed by force centuries ago. The question that remains is, the faith you claim to have, was it really chosen by you? Or did you simply inherit, without noticing, the package that past winners placed in the hands of your ancestors? Does the God you believe in speak to your heart, or merely repeat the voice of colonizers, councils, and emperors you never met? If the religion that reached you came mixed with chains, cultural destruction, and the silencing of entire peoples, to what extent is it a path of liberation? And to what extent is it still, silently, part of the same machine that turned the world into a battlefield in the name of a Christ who may never have been asked what he thought of all this? At the end of all this, you might feel something strange in your chest, as if you had pulled on a forbidden thread, and suddenly an entire fabric began to come undone. We spoke of empires, councils, wars, colonization. We spoke of a Christ used as a banner, of an Antichrist that doesn't need horns to exist. It only needs to live inside structures that, in practice, deny the living Christ within every human being. But now, I want to take our eyes off history and point them back at you. How many of your guilts did you carry just because you were taught you would never be good enough for God? How many times did you feel afraid to ask questions, worried that you were offending heaven, when in reality you were only trying to be honest with yourself? How many parts of you were called impure, unworthy, simply because they did not fit the mold that an empire centuries ago decided to stamp as holy? If your faith was built on fear, humiliation, and blind obedience, maybe it wasn't God speaking to you. Maybe it was just the distant echo of ancient decrees. That doesn't mean throwing everything away. It means something much deeper and more courageous. Handing the key of the sacred back to the only place it should never have left, your inner self. Before any book, any council, any temple, there was silence. And in that silence, something in you always knew when you were getting closer to the truth, and when you were only repeating empty phrases. Maybe the real act of spiritual rebellion today is not to hate religion, but to refuse to live on autopilot, to look at the cross, at history, at this world in ruins. Take a deep breath and ask, with total honesty, if Christ cannot be born in me here and now, then what is all this faith really for?
I will reveal the forbidden wisdom.